Hello, we are here today to prepare you to take the Drumming Adjudicator's exam. The material that we're going to go over today will help you in figuring out how to answer the questions correctly to pass your exam. Tom Foley and I will be here going through the material with you, and as we go through each point, we'll both take turns having discussions and giving our views on what each answer possibly could be, so that there's more than one correct answer to almost everything you see here. We're going to be giving you some examples of possible correct answers, realizing this may not be completely a complete list that you may feel free to add to as well. Okay, so let's begin. Feel free to stop this and take notes at any point. And welcome. First thing we're going to talk to you about is music theory. On your exam, you will have to reproduce this chart. And I would suggest right now, while you're watching this, get out some paper and start reproducing this and practice writing this and stay organized. At the very top, write the open circle, which is a whole note. And then you need to list the note value, which is 4 beats. Moving down, draw the arrow down. You will then see 2 half notes, which are worth 2 beats. Moving down, you'll see 4 quarter notes, worth 1 beat. 1/8 notes, they're worth a half a beat each. Remember, each of those groups have 2 1/8 notes in them, so each of those groups are worth a full beat. 16th notes, each individual note is worth 1/4 of a beat. Moving down again, 32nd notes, each individual note are worth 1/8 of a beat. So you can see 1 whole note takes up the same amount of space as 2 half notes, same amount of space as 4 quarter notes, same space as 8 1/8 notes, and so forth, 16 16th notes, 32 32nd notes. Each group is worth 1 beat, assuming that we're in 4/4 or 2/4, 3/4 time.
Is this usually referred to as subdivision?
Yes, this is subdividing each beat. Then you also have to write down equivalent rests for each note. For the whole note, you're going to put a hole, and the easy way to remember this one is it looks like there's a hole in the ground. If you look at the bar line, there's a hole underneath what you pretend you're walking on the ground like you're going golfing. You put your golf ball in that hole, and this is the confusing one because it looks a lot like a half note rest. And the way to remember that one is it's on top of the line, so it might look like it's a man wearing a hat. Looks a lot like a half note rest. Hat, H-A for half, H-A for hat. That's how I remember it. Quarter note rest. Looks like a lightning bolt. As a matter of fact, when I draw it, just handwritten, I just draw a lightning bolt, and everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about. 1/8 note. This is, and the next chart will show you this too, but that's one individual 1/8 note not grouped together. And then the equivalent rest looks like a little Irish walking stick, a little shillelagh. That's how I remember what it looks like. 16th note rest, put 2 handles on it, double shillelagh. And there's all of the examples again. And here's the one that was not on that chart, hardly ever used, but you still have to know it exists and you'll have to write it on your exam. It's a 32nd note rest. Has 3 handles on it. Triple shillelagh, that's how I remember it. And you'll notice that as you move your way down that chart, every single time you go from the whole note down, you add something to the notes. You go from a whole note with just an open circle. You move your way down, you add a stem to it for the half note. You move down to a quarter note and you color the circle in. You go down to the 1/8 note, you add 1 flag, 16th note, another flag, 32nd note, another flag. So as you move your way down that chart, you add something to it every single time. And also, as you move your way down, every single note gets exactly twice as fast as the note that was above it on the chart. It's really important to remember. You'll also have to be able to produce an individual note of each group. The half note, the whole note, the quarter note, they're already individual. So I'm just going to focus on the ones that are typically grouped. This is what an 1/8 note looks like. Looks like a quarter note with 1 flag on it. 16th note, looks like a quarter note with 2 flags on it. And a 30-second note looks like a quarter note with 3 flags on it.
So the rests basically have the same number of flags as the note they're replacing.
Exactly. Yeah, so if you compare the rests to the notes, the 8th note, 16th note, and 32nd note, the number of flags match on the notes matches the number of handles, if you will, on the rests. Exactly. Okay. Next thing you'll have to produce is a grand staff, sometimes called a great staff. Those two terms are interchangeable. This is what it looks like. So you'll have to draw this. So as you're watching this, pull out some paper, some pencils, and draw this. Each staff will have 5 lines on it, and you will connect it by a brace. And you draw what looks like a big G. It is a treble clef. Practice drawing that. It's kind of difficult sometimes. Make sure it looks nice. Make sure that the loop right here goes around. This is the most important part right here. That loop has to go around that second line from the bottom. That is the very important part of the treble clef as you draw it. Everything else you can get away with a little bit sloppy.
What's that thing on the left-hand side? The brace, did you call it?
Yes, that's a brace, and that'll be labeled next. And at the bottom, there's a bass clef. The important part about that are the 2 dots. They have to be on either side of the second line from the top. So again, when you draw on the treble clef, practice it, but make sure this loop goes around the second line, or it's wrong. The bass clef has to have these 2 dots on either side of the second line from the top. And then the whole thing has to be connected by this brace, which looks like a big bracket. They're all intended to be together. And then the clefs, the treble clef and the bass clef, name these lines and spaces so that we know which note to put on. When we put the notes in the staff, we know what to call them and what sounds to make for them.
Ed, from a drummer's point of view, where would such a thing come into play?
This is mostly dealing with the tuning of bass and tenor drums and knowing the relative pitch to the bagpipes around them. Another point, actually, I was going to make here is that anytime that you're an adjudicator, you're a judge, you're known as some kind of musical expert, especially to the people that are coming to compete. And to me, it's very important that the judge be able to talk at the same musical level as in some 8-year-old who learned something in their 3rd grade general music class at school. They should be able to talk in the same terms. So all of these things are completely related to the tuning of instruments in the whole genre.
You've met the same 8-year-old as I did.
I know quite a few of those guys. And you better be able to talk at the same level as them, or else you've just lost their respect and whoever they talk to. So you have to be you might have to expand your horizons a bit to know something more than what you need to know just for what a snare drum sounds like. Again, to be a musical expert, an adjudicator that people look up to. Okay, so in here, when you have the treble clef, you have, again, you mark that line. So this treble clef is also known as a G clef because that circles around that G line. So if you're looking at just the lines, the mnemonic device to remember it, going from the bottom to the top, is every good boy does fine. E, G, B, D, F. Lots of people have lots of different sentences for that. Feel free to make up your own. This is just the most commonly used one. I choose to continue to use it. And then the spaces are named differently. If you go from the bottom to the top, you spell the word face. F-A-C-E. And the way you remember which is that face and space rhyme. Face goes within the space. Put your face in the space. Bass clef. This is also known as an F clef because the 2 dots are on either side of the line marked, as you can see, with an F. So if you do the lines from the bottom up, similar sentence, but it's good boys do fine always. G, B, D, F, A. Spaces are named. We don't have just one cute little word this time. We have to do another sentence. All cows eat grass. A-C-E-G. That way you know which space or which line is named for. If there's a note on one of those lines or spaces, you know what the name of it is, and you also know what sound you're going to create with it, what note to play. Here they are together. On the left, you see the entire grand staff without the clefs, and they just basically, it's the alphabet. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and you start over again. We don't go past G in the musical alphabet. So if you can't figure out which note's which, if you can't remember the sentences, you can always just use the alphabet. Just go from where you are, move your way up, say the alphabet, and every time you get to G, start over again. But don't skip any lines or spaces this time. Whatever line you're on, go up to the next space, to the next line, to the next space, to the next line, saying the alphabet. You'll be correct. Now, the next step here is to learn about what we call ledger lines. Ledger lines are notes that are either above or below the staff. The most commonly used ledger line is the one in the middle of the entire grand staff, and that's actually called middle C. It's in the middle, and if you see where it lines up right here, there's that C right there. It's exactly in the center, and it lines up right there. So if we did good boys do fine always, there's A, the next space up doing the alphabet would be B, next line up would be C. It matches up. If we looked at the treble clef, every good boy does fine, right? So the bottom line is E. Go backwards in the alphabet is D, and then the note below that would be C. So you can see where it matches up, how it's relating. And here's they all lined up again for you. And this is how you would note the notes on each staff. You have to put the entire dot inside the space, or have the line go through the middle of the line, or yeah, the line go through the middle of the note head. So you're very clear on which note is which. If it kind of goes through, it might be marked wrong. Be extremely clear and distinct when you're writing these notes down. Use a pencil, and if you make a mistake, erase it completely and try it again. There's a quick reminder: treble clef, bass clef, and there's your brace. Bass clef lines. Good boys do fine always, and then there's a middle C. And that red bracket is the same middle C for both clefs. It's the exact same note. Spaces going up, all cows eat grass. Treble clef, if you continue up after the middle C, is every good boy does fine on the lines. Spaces, the word face, rhymes with space. Be able to reproduce this or something similar for the test, so you know how this goes. More ledger lines for you. Above the, I'm mostly concerned about the notes above the treble clef line. As you move up, every good boy does fine. Here's the F. Next space up is G. Next line up is A. Next space up is B, and so forth and so on. Don't skip any lines or spaces. And as you can see, it's the alphabet. You stopped at G, you start over again. A, B, C, D, E, F. You continue going up. And here, we're working our way down ledger lines. And once you get past B, we're getting down here to the A. This is actually starting where the bass clef would be. So we're not going to be concerned with that because there's a bass clef for our purposes. Bass clef ledger lines. Again, there's middle C. As you continue going up, once you get to E, you're now in the treble clef. So we're not going to worry about those. We've already learned those. But the bass clef ledger lines going backwards through the alphabet, because we're going down. If you start on the lowest line, it's good boys do fine always. So the lowest line is G. Go down one, F. So you're going from a line to a space is F. Down to the next line is E. Down to the next line, or next space is D, etc., etc. Again, just use the alphabet forward or backwards, depending on whether you're going up or down. Okay, moving on. Dotted notes. We use dotted notes a lot in pipe band drumming, a lot. So it's really important to know exactly what that means. Typically, if you have a dot on a note, we just say you hold it longer. Or we call it sometimes dot and cut. So you cut the note means you go short-er. But we actually have exact measurements for what you're supposed to do with that. It's not just short-er or long-er. There's an exact measurement. I want to show you what that is. Dotted note. If you add a dot to a note, you add half of that note's value. So first example here is if you have a whole note. We already said earlier, a whole note is worth 4 beats. If you add a dot to it, you add half of that value. So if it's 4, half of 4 is 2, plus 2 equals 6. So a dotted whole note would be worth 6 beats. Moving down, dotted half note. Half note's worth 2 beats. Half of 2 is 1, so 2 plus 1 is 3. Now we get into fractions. So dotted quarter note. A quarter note itself is worth 1 beat, so half of 1 is a half, so a dotted quarter note is worth 1.5 beats. Eighth note, worth a half a beat. A half of a half is a quarter, so then you have 3/4 of a beat that note is worth. And this is as far as we're going to go with it. Dotted 16th note is already worth 1/4 of a beat. Half of a fourth is an eighth. So add that together, you have 3/8 of a beat. And we actually use dotted 16th notes a lot. The most commonly used ones would be especially for snare drumming, would be the dotted 16th note and the dotted 8th note. But the other ones are absolutely used. Okay, triplets. Triplets are 3 notes that occupy the same space that 2 notes of that same value would normally occupy. Sometimes we say that's 3 notes in the time of 2. So that example that I'm showing right now is a triplet and then 2 8th notes. So it's an 8th note triplet. Those 3 notes take up the exact same amount of space as the 2 8th notes do.
Ed, will you be talking more about dotted notes?
Yes. We'll talk more about that as we get into the music writing. If you want to add something, you're welcome to.
I just wanted to...
Sure.
Again, subdivision, you dot a note, you still have to account for that somewhere, because you have to cut another note to make up for that. Does that come in the presentation?
Yes. Yeah, we'll talk again. We'll talk about that when we're doing the math on the music writing part towards the end. But that was just some people know that it means they hold it longer. But I wanted to give the math on it.
Double dots also.
Yes.
Occasionally.
Yes, occasionally it happens. So what Tom was just saying is that if you dot a note, you add half the value somewhere. So you still have to make up for that by taking it away from somewhere else, which we call a cut note, which means you may turn, if it's a dotted 8th note, the other 8th note will then turn into a 16th note to make up.
Can't expand or contract.
Exactly.
To stay the same.
You'll only have so much space in the measure. So if you add length to a note one place, you have to take length away from a note somewhere else, within that measure somewhere, somehow. A lot of times we'll do it back to back, but you don't have to. Okay, so anyway, back to triplets. Triplets occupy the same space of 2 notes of the same value would normally occupy. So if you play 3 in the time of 2, if I'm playing just triplets, or I'm sorry, we'll just play 8th notes, in the same space I can play triplets. So the exercise here is just repeat it over and over again. So that's the relationship between 8th note triplet and just plain 8th notes. But as we said, any notes of the same value, so we frequently will play 16th note triplets, very common. So the exercise here would be 16th notes, and then we play 16th note triplets after that. So it's and the way I have it written there is there's an arrow pointing to 2 16th notes, takes up the exact same amount of time as 3 16th notes in the triplet. Essentially, in this case, each triplet or 2 16th notes will take up exactly 1/2 of the beat. Again, we use those a lot. This one isn't used quite as often, but it absolutely is possible. Quarter note triplets. and it seems like it's a really big slowdown. Sometimes this is used at the end of a tune for a big finale.
Sometimes called slow triplets.
Yes, these slow triplets. So you play normal quarter notes on the beat, and towards the end, for a big finale, might play a quarter note triplet. It just feels like you're really slowing down. But in the same space you play the 2 quarter notes, you have to play 3 quarter notes, quarter note triplet. Okay, and moving on. And again, I know we're moving at a relative fast pace here. If you're watching this, you feel free to stop it at any time and take some notes, digest what's going on, learn more about this on your own, ask some questions, and really understand what's going on here. I'm introducing this material to you so that you're aware of what's going to be on the exam. This is by no means a complete accounting of what you're going to have to know. This is just an idea so that you know what, if you're weak in this area, please go learn about it. Call somebody, take a class, buy a book, look online, whatever, and learn more about these subjects. Just as a quick aside for you. Okay, tied notes. When 2 notes are tied, we do not strike the drum for the second note, which is a bit different idea than a wind instrument who would continue blowing all the way through both notes as they're tied. Or if you're playing the piano, you would hold the key down to make the sound longer. We don't have that. We have what I call implied duration. We hit the note, and we pretend there's a sound going on, even though there's not. So essentially, we have to wait until our next turn longer. So we already talked about dotted notes, so there's a relationship for you. If there's a dotted whole note, and if there's a whole note attached or tied to a half note, sometimes that's easier to read. There's 6 beats there, but you hit the first note. Do not hit the second note if they're tied. These are not rolls. There's no roll symbol here. It's just a tied note. And so forth and so on. There's a dotted half note. So it's a half note tied to a quarter note. Dotted quarter note tied to an eighth note. The exact same relationships we had earlier when I was telling you about the math involved with the dotted notes.
We don't see that too often though, do we? Tied notes and drumming.
That would be more used for bass drumming. But we normally would write a rest just because we just know how to count it, but they absolutely, this is a proper way to write it for sure.
Again, your point that if somebody comes up to you with a sheet of music, you better be able to read it.
Exactly.
Especially if they're arguing about it.
Exactly. So if I, and one thing I've always said is when I'm writing music, I try to make it as simple as possible for whoever's reading it to read. I don't try to wow you with my knowledge of music theory. However, I can guarantee you that every piece of music you're ever going to play will not be written by me. So when I'm teaching somebody how to read music, I try to expose them to everything possible that somebody else might do. And so you're right, if somebody has this written into their music and you made a comment on the judging sheet and they had a question for you, if they bring their music to you, you should at least know this exists and understand what it means, even if you don't use it on a regular basis. So you can ask them a question, oh, is this meant to be a tied note or did you forget the roll symbol? Exactly. Okay, time signatures. What are time signatures? There's some random examples there of time signatures. Sometimes people confuse time signatures, I get this question all the time, with tempo. How fast are you going to play that? Oh, it's a 4/4. That tells me nothing. It's a 6/8. That tells me nothing. It has absolutely nothing to do with how fast you play. It has to do with how we organize all the measures in the music so our little brains can understand them. That really is what they're used for. They organize the music on the sheet of paper so we can talk about it. It organizes it so we have a frame of reference. I can say third line, second measure, third beat, and everybody in the room will be able to find it and we can discuss it right away. Just a way of organizing the music.
Doesn't it also imply a sort of a feel for how the music's going to be played? I agree with you.
Yes.
Nothing to do with tempo. I mean, a 6/8 jig, 6/8 march, two different things, but there is a feeling about a 6.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and that's why people write in different time signatures, because they want a different feel. But But having said that, people write different time signatures depending on what they want to accomplish all the time. And one person might feel it in 12/8, one person might feel it in 4/4, and they're both correct. So it's
not uncommon for a tune to be rewritten in a different time signature.
Absolutely. Matter of fact, we're going to go over a couple of those, not specific tunes, but tune types. So what are time signatures exactly? There's two numbers, as you saw there. There's a top number and a bottom number in every time signature. The top number will tell you how many beats are in each measure. And the bottom number will tell you what kind of note will represent one beat in that measure. Here's some examples. We just talked about 4/4. In a 4/4, the top number tells you how many beats are in the measure. So in this case, there are 4 beats in each measure. And the beat is represented by a quarter note. The easy way to remember that is if you remember math class, 1/4 is the same as a quarter. You go to McDonald's, buy a quarter pounder. The wrappers used to have 1/4 written on the wrapper. So it's a quarter. Another example, 2/4. So similar to a 4/4, except for the measure will only have 2 beats in each measure, but the beat is still represented by a quarter note. A couple more examples here. And 6/8 are, we're going to talk about compound versus simple in a moment here, but very strictly speaking, 6/8, 6 beats in each measure. The beat is represented by an 8th note. So that's the 8 on the bottom says there are going to be 6 8th notes in every measure, or something that is equal to 6 8th notes. Another example, 9/8, 9 beats in every measure. Beat is again represented by an 8th note. This is one that confuses people sometimes. 2/2, 2 beats in every measure, and the bottom number tells you that the beat is represented by a half note. So there are 2 half notes in every measure. So if you look at the measure, if you think, remember math, 4/4 and 2/2, you're just reducing it. So if you're not looking at the time signature, if you just saw a measure of 4/4 or a measure of 2/2, you might get confused which is which. There's a different feel to them though.
Reels are generally 2/2.
Yeah, generally reels would be 2/2, hornpipes would be 2/4. And I've heard debates numerous times whether, on both sides of it, why don't we just write everything in 2/4? Why do we do that? Why don't we just write everything in 2/2?
It's a different, again, it's implied a different feel.
It's an implied different feel.
Reels do not feel like matches.
Not at all.
Or shouldn't.
Correct. And a previous discussion I've had with people on that same subject, again, this particular video is to help you prepare for this exam. And both time signatures exist on this exam, so you have to know both of them. Once you pass the exam, you can discuss the merits of abolishing 2/2 or 2/4 if you want to, but in the meantime, learn the material, live with it, conform, and pass the exam. Then we'll talk about that. Okay, and again, another example, 3/2, more and more being used now. Used to be a special thing. Almost every band that feels like they have to play their reel in a 3/2 version at some point or another at this now. 3 beats in every measure, and again, the beat is represented by a half note. Okay, now this deals with simple and compound time signatures. Here's the definition of what they are, then we're going to talk about more what that means. Here's the textbook answers. Simple time signatures. This is from the handouts that we have. The essential characteristic of a simple time signature is that each beat is divisible by 2. Compound. The essential characteristic of a compound time signature is that the beat note is a dotted note and is divisible by 3. That's why compound time is sometimes referred to as triplet time or triple time. And here's what we're talking about there. And a top line there, it's 6/8. The beat note is actually a dotted quarter note. And a dotted quarter note is equal to 3/8 notes, as we discussed earlier. So in this case, the beat is actually the dotted quarter note. If you're marching or tapping your foot along, the dotted quarter note is the beat. And as you're playing along, here's the beat. So if it's playing that rhythm, I just divided each beat into 3. So typically this will be used for jigs or 6/8 march with, we're not talking about dot and cut yet, but that would be used frequently for faster tunes that are 6/8, like a jig or a march.
So there's still 2 beats and a bar feel to it?
Yes. So I said earlier that very strictly speaking, yes, there's 6 eighth notes and the 8th note gets the beat. However, the way it's commonly used is to put it into compound time when we're going faster, in the faster tempos. If we were to play a slower tempo, like a slow march or a slow air, frequently we would count out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and actually give a beat for every single note there. And then a simple time signature, again, example here would be 3/4. This also has 6/8 notes in it, but completely different feel. Here's the beat, so go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and as opposed to that's the biggest difference between compound and simple time signatures. Now, we alluded to this already, but this is, again, something that you have to be very aware of for your exam. What time signatures do we typically use in pipe bands? Actually, before I start pulling these up, Tom, you want to throw a couple out?
2/4, 6/8, 3/4, 9/8.
And then what tunes are associated with those?
The retreat airs are 3/4s. The marches are 2/4s, sometimes 4/4. Competition marches are usually 2/4.
Except for sometimes in the quick march medleys, a lot of bands will be playing the 4/4s and 3/4s.
Yeah.
But
Hornpipes, you get, they're usually 2/4, I believe. Hornpipes.
typically,
You
yeah.
get that jaunty feeling about them.
Yes.
6/8s, you have 6/8 march, and also 6/8 jigs. You can get 9/8 jigs,
Yes.
sometimes called slip jigs. Slow airs, 3/4s, most of the time.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the type of thing you have to know for your exam. I'm going to put up some examples here. This is by no means an all-inclusive list. It's some examples. And as people get more and more innovative, they take types of tunes and fit them into different time signatures. And that happens all the time. There's new examples every year. Listen to the World CD, go to competitions. You'll hear all sorts of examples all the time. So this list is ever expanding. This is just a sample of possible answers.
Another one that keeps sneaking in every so often is a 12/8.
Yes.
Which is kind of like a 6/8, but it's got a long feeling. It's like a 4/4 as opposed to a 2/4.
Yes.
There's a longer feeling about it.
Yeah, I've played some 12/8 marches in competition before, and they do seem to go on for a long time. No, but they're a lot of fun. Okay, here's some of some samples. 2/4, as we talked about, marches, hornpipes. Again, not all inclusive. You can do whatever. Here's a 3/4. Retreat march. Typically a 3/4 march is known as a retreat. Waltz. Lots of waltz is being used instead of slow airs now, or as a variation on a hornpipe or a reel. Of course, slow marches too. There's even an example I've heard of a 3/4 Strasbe. It's very interesting, but it exists. So it's a good answer. 4/4. Good other point here to know in the theory. Sometimes 4/4 is known as common time. They're interchangeable. You can use both of them at any point. It's the exact same thing. Common marches. Strasbes. Most Strasbes are 4/4. 5/4. Typically we use those as marches. There's only a couple marches, but they're played a lot. You could, again, this is, there's some innovative people who have taken waltzes and put them into 5/4 time. 2/2. We talked about this earlier. Reels and whatnot are typically done in 2/2. It's also known as cut time. We talked about that earlier, that the 4/4s and the 2/2s are very similar in the way that they are written. But a lot of times the cut time, you cut all the note values in half if you want to write it out properly. And the tempo normally will go a little bit faster, so you'll tap your foot twice in the same amount of time you tap your foot 4 times in the 4/4. Reel, hornpipes, sometimes rearranged as a reel. That's one of the most difficult ones for people to tell apart by listening. So let's pay attention to that. 3-2, again, we talked earlier, reels, a lot of times you do them as a 3-2 as well as a 2-2 back-to-back. Continuing on, 6/8, jigs, marches, completely different feel. Slow marches, a lot of times people will write a waltz in 6/8 time as opposed to doing their 3-4, 1, 2, 3. They'll do a 6/8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's just another way to organize it on the paper, but it's absolutely done. 9/8 jig, and I don't have it on here, but Tom mentioned that they frequently call that a slip jig. It's an Irish type of jig. 9/8 marches, slow marches, waltzes again. 12/8 jigs, marches, slow marches. And sometimes I've seen people write out Strathspeys. A lot of drummers play a very triplety feel to their Strathspeys. So instead of writing a triplet sign over every single triplet, they will write it out in 12/8. And then there's lots of other time signatures that could be used, 5/8, 3/8, 7/8. A lot of times these are variations within a tune. They're playing a jig or whatnot, and they have a little bridge or one or two measures that they'll slip this time signature in to change the feel up and then go back to the regular time.
Ed, would this be an appropriate junction to mention just what you talked about, the triplet feel on Strathspeys? Mm-hmm. That comes in for a lot of criticism, especially in Scotland. They do not like the triplety feel on the Strathspeys.
Yes.
But it's much more a dot and cut feel. The dancers don't dance in a triplet fashion.
Right. I agree. I'm just telling you what has.
Does this sound as if I've been told that by someone?
Maybe. I may have seen that on a sheet before too. But yeah, a lot of times people will put a triplet in there and they'll write it out as a 12/8. But having said that, if it's too triplety, they call it there's too much of a jig feel to them. If you play them as a too triplety, if that's even a word. And so as an aside from just the theory, avoid playing it like that if you can help it. Go for the dot and cut type of feel as opposed to the triplet feel. In a Strathspey. Okay, and I just mentioned here about the 5/8, 3/8, 7/8, or whatever. Variations on slow airs, jigs, marches, waltzes. People will put in a measure or two or a quick little section of another odd time signature. I saw an entire slow air written out in 15/4 before.
Good God.
Yeah. Basically, it was just a long slow air without bar lines. But you would never know it by listening to it. Didn't have a 15-beat phrase pattern to it. That's how they organized it on the paper. It's actually beautiful. Okay. Time signature changes can be confusing, especially as we get more and more complicated. People get more and more innovative, slip in these little things we just talked about. So the discussion part here, there's no real right or wrong answer to this, is would we like to get a list of competitors' tunes and time signatures before they come on? Do we want to be prepared for them? So if you say yes, you have to have a reason why. That's how most of this exam goes. If you have an opinion about something, say what it is and say why. There's more than one correct answer. Or no, why. There's no real right answer for it. Just your opinion and be able to give reasons why. Tom, do you have an opinion on that?
No, I don't have any problem with it as right now. I think as an adjudicator you should know what you're listening to.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Able to discuss it.
Yes, I actually agree with that. What's one more thing to look at when you're listening to a band? You're trying to listen to the technique, listen to their sound, listen to their tuning, listen to their unison, listen for the dynamics, and all these other things we're listening for. I don't want to have to read a list of time signatures and waiting for it to happen. I'd rather feel it with them and be part of the performance with them and notice what's going on. But I know that there's other people that don't agree with that. I wish they could be here to tell you, but they prefer to know it ahead of time so they're not surprised, so they can listen for it, so they can be prepared to critique how it's played as opposed to being surprised and then having to pull their heads back into listening for the critique. So I can see both sides of it, absolutely. But I would prefer not to have that. I'd just rather be surprised with everybody, listen to it, be part of it, and appreciate the musicality of it, because what it comes down to is it's a music performance, not a technical performance when I judge the music. So I'd rather be, part of the audience essentially and be surprised by what they're doing. Okay. Some other things that you'll have to know about tempo. What is tempo exactly? Real simply, just the term we use for how fast the music goes. It's a musical term for speed. How is tempo indicated and or measured? Beats per minute. How fast are you going? You put a stopwatch on. 60 seconds later, how many beats did you play? That's how fast you're going. 100 beats per minute, 50 beats per minute, 20, 110, doesn't matter. This is something that whether you're a judge or a pipe major or a lead drummer, this is something really important to know about. What problems result from the improper use of tempo? I hear this all the time. People play something too fast or too slow. It creates problems in the band. So Tom, do you have some?
The first word that springs to mind is ensemble.
Ensemble. Definitely.
You get racing or dragging going on, and it's painful.
Yeah, and there's a lot. This is a very vague question, improper use of tempo. It could mean the pipers are going faster than the drummers or vice versa. The drummers could be slowing down. You could be playing a tune too fast for the particular idiom that you're being played in.
Going to use his idiom, huh?
Yeah, you're playing it too fast or too slow for the particular idiom. You're playing a tune that is too difficult for you to be playing that fast. So some of the problems that arise here.
It happens a lot in Strathspeys. Either drags or it's just going way too fast.
Yes. And so poor execution is the first thing that comes to mind when I hear drummers playing something too fast for themselves. They can't execute it properly, and therefore, like I said earlier, it's a music performance. You're not making good music if you're not executing it properly. It's just not happening.
You lose expression.
Lose musical expression, musical flow can suffer, or be completely lost. Just a bunch of notes played one after the other as fast as you can, or too slow, and then it's very vague as to when the next note's coming and people are listening for it as opposed to playing it together.
Again, maybe this is a good place to mention this. As an adjudicator, one of the things you're really listening for is the flow of the music. Does it flow? And that's a word that I like to use a lot. Sometimes it just doesn't flow at all.
Exactly.
It's jagged.
Jagged, yeah. Musical flow, and this isn't saying that, you can have musical flow to a slow air, you can have musical flow to a jig, you can have musical flow to a fast tune or a slow tune, but make sure you're playing the tempo properly to have that happen. Phrasing can suffer. The character of the tune, this is, we're talking about the idiom, the character of the tune is not conveyed, losing the feel of the music. There's lots of problems arise from that, and sometimes, and I've seen this with bands, is they actually take the time and slow it down to the proper tempo or speed it up to the proper tempo. Playing comes together just like that. It's just a matter of having the patience to slow it down a little bit. You don't feel like you have to rush to the end. Have enough professionalism to let each note sound on its own, and also not to try to play something that's too difficult for yourself. I've seen groups that do that. They'll play something that's way too difficult for themselves, so they'll always play it very slow so they can get all the execution in, but in the meantime, like Tom was just saying, they lose their musical flow in the process. Okay, we just talked about this a little bit. Poor ensemble.
Separation.
Yeah, separation between the groups. One problem that I did not write on here, especially with the drummers, if the pipers play a tune too slow, the drummers have a question of how many roll pulses to play if it slows down or speed up. We don't have the ability to hold a note longer and then come back in like some pipers want to do. So we actually have to add a roll pulse or extend our roll pulses, and we have to decide what that is. As a group, we can't just magically make that happen.
And what hand do you end on?
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I mean. So if you extend the pulses a bit, you might end on the same hand, but if you have to add one more pulse, you might end on the opposite hand of what you planned on before. So that's something that pipe majors and lead drummers need to really talk about when you're planning a tune. What is the goal tempo? Not the tempo that the pipers are practicing at as you're learning the tune. That's completely different. So when I'm writing a drum score, I'll ask for a recording of the tune at the tempo that you plan on playing it. So, and a lot of it is for roll pulses.
The real world situation with the roll pulses, every drummer in that corps has got a different idea of where that pulse is going to end.
Exactly.
It's going to end on, and they worry about it, and that's the next thing suffers.
Exactly. So you want to make sure you're really consistent with what you're planning on. So
what do you find is the most effective way, as a piper, I'm asking this question, what do you find to be the most effective way to address attaining proper tempo? Because you've got two corps that oftentimes have got very disparate musical backgrounds. They might have the same idea about what it is they want to do, but what's the best way to establish that right tempo that everybody's comfortable with, that's not too fast or too slow?
one of the things I suggest is, prior to the band even getting the music, that the pipe major and the lead drummer, or whoever is writing the music, sit down and discuss that before the band gets involved. So there's a definite goal in mind from the leaders. So if the pipe major plays a tune, I always have a recorder with me. Play that tune for me so I know what tempo you want. And if it's too fast, I'll stop it right then and say, you know, for the type of tune we're playing, this is too fast. Let's try it a little bit slower, and we'll have a give and take. Or if it's too slow, I say, you know what, is that the tempo you're playing it at because that's where you want it, or are you just learning it? Sometimes they'll say, you know, I'm just learning it. I say, you know what, play it for me when you can play it up to speed. So I try to get that in, and then I get a metronome out and measure where it is, and when I pass music out, I'll write the beats per minute at the top of it, and make everybody, pipers and drummers, practice with the metronome at that tempo. WUSPBA, if it's 110 or if it's 112, they know it right away. So we try to have that as a baseline. Then if we go up and down, again, a lot of communication needed.
Do you have a set range of tempos for different kinds of music, like 2/4s, 4/4s, or spades, reels?
Actually, I do.
This is generally understood.
There's some generally understood tempos, but it's not something I have in the presentation here, but yeah, I have, like Strasberg's, I was just saying, about 110 to 116, around there. Again, give or take a couple beats, you can play with it. 2/4 marches, probably, depending on the group, 76, 78, maybe 80, but that's the absolute fastest. So that's absolute fastest. The hornpipes I like in the upper 70s as well, 78 beats per minute, things like that.
Some tunes go better, a little faster. So I think to come back to Bob's point here, I totally agree with what you're saying about the pipe major and the drum sergeant getting together. So another situation sometimes arises once you do have that session. Sometimes you say, this ain't going to work at all. You know, the way you want to play that, the drummers couldn't play that as musically as we should. So maybe we should pick another selection.
Right, and so the other, besides just the rolls, if say the pipers decide they want to play this tune at a slower tempo, and I say, you know what, that's fine, I'll accommodate that.
If you can.
If I can. So if I have agreed, say, no, I will accommodate that. What ends up happening is I'll write a drum score that has a lot more notes in it than if it were faster. So later on, when they decide to go faster, the drummers literally cannot play that many notes that fast. So then we have to go back and rewrite it. So it's really, that communication is really important ahead of time. We can't just feel it faster that day. Sometimes the drummers physically cannot get all those notes in there, because you know, as opposed to having a bunch of empty gaps. And the same thing happens then the opposite way. If it's faster, you write less notes. They try to feel it slower. Then there's huge gaps in drumming, which affects the ensemble. There's no flow. There's no musicality going on because everybody's just waiting for the next note.
The other thing about the use of the metronome is it has become more prevalent now. I mean, not any kind of a new invention, but
correct.
Once you agree on the tempo, that's what you practice at.
Yes. And I've, at band practices, people put them on in big clickers. Sometimes people just turn it on, listen to it, they start, and then when they end, they turn it back on to see how close they are. And they do that as an exercise over and over again. Say, okay, we slow down a little bit, make sure that it doesn't happen, try it again, feel the metronome ahead of time. Which is also another reason why the pipe major sings the tune before you start. It's not just an exercise of futility, you actually get a feel for the tempo. And the pipers should all be moving their fingers for one more run through. The drummers should all be feeling what the drum score is going to sound like and feel like in their fingers during the time the pipe major's singing the tune before you start.
Well, as a matter of fact, I think it's probably true that, now it may not be true for a drumming judge that's in the back of the band, but for an ensemble or piping judge, it's pretty typical to pay attention to the tempo that that pipe major just set.
Drumming judge absolutely does too.
Because we're listening
Every
to
time.
it, and says, okay, let's see how they do.
I do
We
every
haven't
single time.
started the contest yet. That doesn't start until you get the 3-beat rolls, but nevertheless, the pipe major's pretty much set the standard. And so, okay, let's see how they do. Because typically, I may make a comment in the intro. Tempo fell off from what pipe major said, and that's a very, very important thing for a band to know. It may not actually have a whole lot of bearing on the placing of the band. It may have absolutely no effect at the end of the day. But nevertheless, I think that the band needs to know that the pipe major set a tempo, and you either did or didn't do it.
Correct.
I think that I absolutely agree with what
100%.
I know what I think most of the guys do, most of the adjudicators, you're watching that pipe major counting a thing, and you're marking time at the same, and you march in right behind the drum corps, and you can tell right away if they've started to fall back or race ahead, and that happens,
Absolutely.
especially in the lower grades,
Yeah.
where everybody's worried about controlling their instrument and remembering the music and this, that, and the other. But you've got to point it out if it's not happening.
Absolutely. So anybody who's watching this that is not a judge, that's something very important to note, that we just talked about it from an ensemble point of view, from a piping point of view, and from a drumming point of view. We do pay attention to the tempo that the pipe major calls, and that's actually something in here in a little bit. We pay attention to what the pipe major calls, the speed of the rolls, the tempo of the rolls, and then the tempo of the first few bars of the tune, to make sure they're consistent. So, and that would be an improper use of tempo. So that actually ties right in here. The tempo should be consistent by the right quick march through the first part of the first tune.
I think it's to get the band as settled as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Okay. Define the term execution. We use it all the time. Good execution, poor execution. What does it mean? It's just it's a technical term. It's how well you play together. Technical aspect. Are you playing clean? Are your notes defined well? Are you playing accurate rhythms?
Control.
And with control, yes. Correct phrasing, dot and cutting within the meter. So are you executing the notes cleanly? Are you playing them in time to the music in the correct meter and the correct idiom? Define the term phrasing. Another thing that people hear all the time, what does it mean? Good phrasing, poor phrasing, rushed phrasing, ahead of the phrase. What does all that stuff mean? What are we listening for? First thing is you got to play on the beat. There's more to it than that, but you have to start with everybody playing on the beat together. Then you play all parts of the beat together. If the beat is subdivided into 4 sections, all 4 sections of the beat, 1, E, and should be exactly the same, matched up in the entire band. Or part of a triplet, or however you subdivide the beat. We're listening for every single section of the beat all the way through.
One area where you see that not working very well is in tenor chords. So they do split patterns, and they're not dead on.
Yes.
Subdivisions are.
Yeah, good point there. The phrasing of a tenor chord, because we're talking about all the aspects of the drum section here. Tenor chord will frequently have split parts, 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 and 4 and they split it. All those could be any combination of notes there. One of the tips for tenor drummers is to not listen to the person before them. Don't say, oh, she played, now it's my turn. Oh, he played, now it's my turn. By then there's a slight delay from when you hear it to you think it to you play it. You have to know I'm on the and of 2, or I'm on the E of 4, or whatever you're on, and play it, regardless of the people before you or after you got it right or not. You are correct on your spot. That's the difficult part, is you have to be independent at the same time listening to the overall sound of the full group.
One of the things about phrasing that we've been discussing that in the piping clinic is that it's actually probably the fundamental building block for everything else. If a band is not phrasing, then the tunes tend to run together. It makes the breaks rough. It affects the tempos. It affects the expression. So to me, phrasing is really the very, very fundamental thing that a band has to do, and the music has to be phrased together. Everybody has to be phrasing it the same way. And the one advantage that a drum corps does have is that a drum corps has to phrase. You can't simply stand there and beat sticks on a drum. You've got your pauses, you've got everything built into it. And the one thing I've always emphasized with the pipe corps is you got to listen to those drummers, because the drummers are the ones that are phrasing the music. So we need to all phrase it together. And that's really to me, that's the whole key to everything. It's the key to expression, it's the key to tempo, it's the key to ensemble, it's the key to everything.
Making music.
If you don't phrase, you don't have anything.
Exactly.
You have to phrase, and if you do phrase everything together, then, you know, with the proper pickup notes and all that sort of thing, then you're probably going to have ensemble.
Mm-hmm. One of the words that Bob just used that I really liked was the pause. Sometimes at the end, bass drummers are notorious for this. If they're not paying attention to the phrasing, they keep a nice beat and a nice steady tempo, but they never stop. They never stop playing. At the end of a phrase, I like to call it punctuating the phrase. They stop, and then they come back in together, as opposed to just keeping a beat. Even though there's a beat going on, but they don't have to play every single one of them. I like when bass drummers really punctuate, give it maybe a slight accent at the end of a phrase, and then have the pause, and then come back in on the next beat of the next phrase.
It's called voicing.
Yes.
You know?
I agree with what Bob's saying, 99.9%, as he said it, but and drumming certainly should be phrasing, there's no question about it. As long as they're phrasing along with what the pipes are actually trying to convey.
Yes.
But the term that I use a lot is, and it's directly linked with phrasing, is note values. It's giving the proper length, duration to the note. And where it goes wrong usually is somebody can't wait to finish that phrase, and they finish it and they're in the next phrase too soon. Then you get this separation and this tendency to feel of rushing going on.
Yes. Yeah, that happens a lot in the note. Give people the full note values. Again, dotted notes, you have to extend it a little bit longer, and we talked earlier about exactly how long to do that. And rest, because there's nothing going on, people have a tendency to think, well, there's nothing going on, there's something wrong with that. Even though it's only a beat or two, or there's nothing going on, they feel like they have to get back in and make some kind of noise. I compare that to a good stand-up comedian. They know that they've done a really good job. They're professional. They tell a joke, and they stand there and wait for you to laugh. They know that your brain's processing it, and they'll stand there and wait for it to laugh. But a really inexperienced comedian will tell the joke, then when nobody laughs within the first second and a half, they immediately jump into the next joke. And then what happens is people are processing it, and they're about to laugh at the funny, but he's telling something else now, and it really confuses them. So I'd say, have the poise, the professionalism, the patience to stand there, let that note sound, let that rest sound, and come back in when it's time. I think we're moving on from phrasing now. I also wanted to introduce the other voice you've been hearing is Bob Mason here. He is a piping judge and an ensemble judge, giving his opinions and questions from an ensemble judge's point of view. So moving on now. Technique. What exactly is technique? Again, words you hear all the time on your sheet. Good technique, need to work on your technique, uniform your technique. What does it mean? There's certain aspects to it. It's your hand posture. How exactly are your sticks held, or the grip of your sticks? How your sticks are moved and controlled. Do you move your wrists? Do you move your fingers? Do you move your arms? Do you move your shoulders? What exactly is going on? Did you want to add anything into that?
One of the terms you hear a lot is dead sticking.
Mm-hmm.
How would you define that?
Oh, a dead stick is a closed buzz, I think. A dead stick. Typically, we're just doing regular taps, or buzzes for the rolls, or letting the stick bounce for the, But a lot of times we have a dead stick, which is where I take it. I just grip the stick. I push my thumb into my ring finger, if it's a left hand, and then bring my whole arm straight down, and create a dead sound on the stick. And then my right hand, I would take the fingers and push into my hand first, then move my arm down into the drum, creating a dead sound, as opposed to a big, thick buzz sound as you would get for the rolls.
I guess my point was every so often you run across a a drum corps where one or more of the drummers is dead sticking. And it spoils the tone.
Yes.
They're not playing off the drum.
Okay, so as far as the technique goes, if, I said earlier something about uniform technique. Some people might be holding the sticks too tight, as opposed to letting the stick vibrate as you play. They're holding it too tight and strike the drum. It's kind of a dead sound to it.
Very stiff playing.
Yes, very stiff playing. So when they talk about the technique, there's a million different variations on how what people think is good technique, but it comes down to is, are you creating a nice sound off the drum? Is a uniform sound across the whole drum corps?
But as an adjudicator, you have to have a way of expressing that to,
Yes.
to the recipient of your comments.
Correct. So the way I would do it then is I break everything down into 3 different things: taps, bounces, and buzzes. And I try to make all the taps so that it's a nice and light tap and the stick still vibrates on your fingertips. You can feel it vibrating against your fingertips here. Or a buzz, which is where I push the fingers in, like I said before, but not quite as hard as I did for the dead stick, and let it vibrate within my hand. And it should feel like you're holding a vacuum cleaner, a vacuum in the living room. That vibration that you feel in your hand, that's what it feels like as you do a proper roll in your hand. And then the other thing would just be to loosen it up and let the stick bounce. And I literally just say, it's like you're dropping the stick without letting go. Then you control how many times it hits, maybe grabbing it after the second time. And that feels, again, against your fingertips like there's little bubbles if you're doing it properly. That's how I express it to people. Those are the 3 things you do, and then everything else we do is combinations of those 3 things. Again, there's lots of different variations that are absolutely correct, but that's the way I approach it, especially from the basics, the beginning point of view. Okay, now how does this figure into the results? This technique figure into the results. I have talked to people who were upset because a judge mentioned something about their technique and then they were marked down, and they thought they were marked down specifically because of the technique. And what I tried to tell them was it's not specifically because you used that technique, it's because the judge didn't particularly like the sound you created, and they're trying to help you by giving you pointers on your technique. So to me, that's how it figures into the results, is whatever, it comes down to what kind of sound you're making. I've also seen people, I look at their hands like, that shouldn't sound good, but somehow they're making it work. And I give them credit for what sounds good. So how does technique affect the sound? We just talked about that a little bit. If you're holding the stick too tight, it deadens the sound, it even flattens the sound off, because the thing that vibrates doesn't vibrate. Totally different sound, depending on how you're striking the drum.
That latter point there comes up all the time in midsection playing. Tenor.
Yes.
You get a lot of tenor chords where they're actually just striking the drum hard. And if you look at the really good players, they flip off the drum.
Yes. Yeah.
And it cuts the overtones out. And
they let the head vibrate, let the head sound without deadening it, but they also don't create the unwanted overtones by striking too hard or into it, not pulling up.
From an adjudicator point of view, you have to be able to identify that and convey the problem.
Correct. So yeah, so if you see that or hear that, you need to be able to identify it. It's not a tuning issue necessarily, but a technique issue, and then say, this is how you can fix it.
Bass drums also, very same thing in bass drum.
Yes, hitting too much into the drum as opposed to striking,
Playing off
of
it.
it. So how does the technique affect the sound? Well, positively or negatively, depending on the sound you're creating. If you have proper technique, like we just talked about, then you'll have a positive effect. You'll have a negative effect if you're doing some of the poor things we talked about. What about other techniques? There's multiple techniques, different types of drumming. Sometimes people come from a different style of drumming and come and play in a pipe band, and their grip is slightly different. So how do we handle that? Match grip. Right now, most people in pipe bands do play just a regular traditional grip, left hand, right hand. But then there's a match grip where both hands look like the right hand. I guess you could do it this way too as a match grip. But reverse grip, where instead of doing this, you do that. And then a DCI grip, which instead of having the thumb on the stick, frequently have the first finger over top and the thumb over there so that the stick doesn't move up. You use your wrist a lot more than we would in a pipe band. There's a discussion again here. There's no really right answer for it, just what your opinion is.
What comes out of it at the other end.
Yes. So my opinion, especially on the first two, the match grip and the reverse grip, because the way the drums are now, we used to play on a sling and the drum would sit here, which was important for you to have traditional grip so that the stick laid on the drum properly.
Remember it well.
So do I, very well. It's only the very past like 10, 12 years that we've really started, everybody's been using harnesses. And now the drums have the ability to be more level. And they're right with you and they stay with you. They don't move around a bit. So they stay right with you. So if you've learned from the get-go, match grip, if it's good enough for your right hand, why isn't it good enough for your left hand? Again, no right or wrong answer there. And if you learn this way, the reverse grip, if that's the way you learn from the get-go, you're going to sound better than if you try to change your grip over. Anybody who plays one way, try reversing it and see how you sound. Or this way, see how you sound. So whatever makes the best sound, in my opinion. I've heard a lot of discussion about, if you're right, because no matter how hard you try, your right hand and your left hand, no matter what grip you're using, don't sound exactly alike. You can try as much as you want. There's going to be slight differences. So people have said, if I'm holding my right stick like this and you're holding your right stick like this, they're going to sound a little bit different. Maybe they're not going to have the optimal sound. Maybe. Again, whatever's best for your individual situation and your individual core or the band that you're judging. How much is it affecting their sound compared to how the other groups sound that you're judging? You're comparing them. It comes back to the sound created, just like we talked about. What kind of sound are you making? Is it a musical sound? Are you creating nice music? All this other stuff we're talking about comes back to, are we making good music? Is this something that you want to listen to? Something I want to listen to? Okay. We talk about a lot of these terms all the time. Characteristics of sound. Pitch. These are terms that you have to know about. People use them all the time. If somebody asks you what pitch is, you better be able to say it. This is a textbook answer. Just be able to know these in general terms. If you have your own wording, that's fine as long as you have the general gist of it for the exam. Pitch, height or depth of sound created by frequency. Pitch, so is it high sound or a low sound? Or what frequency is that sound within each note? Volume. This isn't high and low. This is the intensity, the loudness or softness determined by amplitude. Exactly how loud are you playing? How quiet are you playing? Which is something that the pipers don't deal with, except for to have a stronger reed or a weaker reed. So once they're set, they're gone. So any volume changes come from the drummers. So what's something we really need to be worried about? Quality. Quality of your sound, also called timbre. T-I-M-B-R-E is pronounced timbre. It creates the character or tone color of the instrument and is determined by harmonics and overtones. It is why different instruments have different sounds. But which is why, for example, a bagpipe playing the same note as a trumpet, as the same note as a piano, as a flute, all sound different. They all have different timbres. There's different quality of sound depending on the instrument you're playing. That's where it comes from. If you're playing a bass drum versus a snare drum, totally different timbre. Even if you tune a bass drum and a tenor drum to the exact same pitch, there's going to be different timbres because of the different drums, different sizes of the drums, different materials used in the drums, different mallets being used, there's different heads being used. You're going to have a slightly different sound, or frequently described as tone colors, different colors put into the performance.
Well, one of the things about that's really critically important is you can have bands that have got the right pitch. You can have bands that have got a good volume. The quality of the sound that they produce, that timbre, can actually be kind of dull. For example, if you've got chanters that are heavily taped, you can have the right pitch, but one of the dangers of that tape is that you can dull the sound. You lose some of the overtones that the instrument is capable of. And I've seen the same thing with drum corps, and midsections in particular really affect this, where the sound that you get is a very, very dull sound. And usually the way I describe a band that's got timbre, that's got a really good quality of sound, is I will note right off the bat after I've listened to the band for a few bars of their intro. What I'm listening for is, does the overall sound of the midsection and snares move through the circle such that it blends into the whole sound of the band. And the bass and tenors are very, very important for that. If they're properly tuned and at the right pitch and their volume is such that they're not overwhelming the sound of the band, what I should hear in the background is a very, very pleasing overtone from those deeper notes that they produce. And once you get, when a band gets that, then you've got all of that quality of sound that you're looking for. You've got the high notes, you've got the low notes, and they all blend together.
Okay, what's the relationship between pitch and the quality of a snare drum sound? Again, this is kind of a discussion question. There's lots of schools of thought on this. If the pitch is too high, though, what can happen?
It becomes very thin sound.
Very thin sound.
And it doesn't really carry anything. You get no projection.
Reduced dynamic range. You can't, because of the thin sound, lack of projection, you can't get the the higher dynamic levels. You can't get the upper dynamic levels as well.
It's probably cutting right across the pipes, the harmonics from the pipes.
Yes, especially
adding to the overall tone of the band.
Right. When I hear a drum corps that the snares are pitched too high, again, it's thin, there's no projection, especially if an ensemble judge is standing at the top end of the circle through the pipes. If it doesn't project, any dynamics you are able to get are completely lost.
And one of the important things that not only drum corps needs to be aware of, but the pipe corps as well, is that what an ensemble judge will do is usually try to find that spot where you can hear the entire band, because that's what, when it comes to sound, that's what you really want to listen to. And there actually are places, it depends on the size of the band, but there are places in a circle where you can't get that projection no matter how well you're tuned. So you kind of have to walk around and find that sweet spot that a band has, and it always varies from band to band. But it's important to know that an ensemble judge is doing that. And one of the things that tells me that there might be an issue with tuning is if I'm having a hard time finding that spot. If I can't find a position around that circle where I can hear the whole blend, then there's usually an issue with the two cores and the way they're tuned together.
Fair enough. Okay, so now if the pitch of the snare drums are too low, what are some problems there?
You got dullness of tone. Dull.
Exactly. Dull sound, poor definition in your playing it gets very, the word I like to use is muddy. You can't hear exactly what's going on, so almost like the notes as you play them, they can become fatter and they overlap with each other more. You can't hear every single individual note.
Yeah, you don't have a crisp sound such that you can hear the phrase breaks and all that sort of thing. Everything just sort of kind of blends together.
Right, and it affects phrasing. You can't hear how well the notes are separated within the phrase. You can't hear their rhythmic accuracy. So you don't know if it's their playing or the tuning. I've actually marked that on sheets before. I said, I can't tell how well you're playing together because of how your drums are tuned. It's actually impossible that the notes are so fat because of the tuning of your drum that I cannot hear your execution at all.
There's not much room for dynamics in a situation like that. Light and shade,
Yeah.
It disappears.
Correct. Okay, snare drum, definite or indefinite pitch instrument.
I would say it's indefinite.
I would say it's indefinite too, but there's a definite relationship anyway between the pitch that you want for your snare drums compared to the pipe corps. There's no real, right, I mean, I've never heard anybody say they're tuning their snare drums to an A or to a D or anything like that. The bass and tenor drums used to be indefinite pitch. They used to be a nice boom. I want a nice thick resonant boom. Now, nice thud. But now it's come into their definite pitch instruments. They're creating chords, they're creating harmonies, they're creating structure for the tunes, or supporting the tunes with chords. Snare drums, though, again, you have to be aware. Normally when I'm tuning them up, I will listen to the pipes warming up and making sure that I'm blending nicely with them. If the pitch is lower, then I won't crank the drums up. If the pitch is higher, I will, depending on what's going on. And there's different ways to accomplish that. But
Alex Duffert once famously commented on the score sheet that the bass drum sounded like a fireside rug. That about says it all, doesn't it?
Is there a characteristic, though, of the drums where you can tell whether you're in the range that you want? Because, for example, I'm talking about physical characteristic, where the snares are set, that sort of thing. Because with pipes, you can sort of tell if you're at the pitch that you want, depending on where your drums are tuned. You know, if you're showing a little bit of hemp, you know, you're probably, all things being equal, you're probably at about the pitch that you want. If you're not, then you're probably too sharp. Is there a characteristic of the drum chords, the different types of drums, that sort of tells you that you're in the range that you want?
I wouldn't say from the outside of the circle you can tell. If I turn the snare drum over and I can see where the snares are set, then yes, I can give you a pretty good rough estimate. By look, if the snares are centered, the bottom snares are centered. If they're off the drum, I can. By the way, there's a whole art to setting the bottom snares and the top snares on the drum properly. So if I took the drum and turned it over and looked on the inside, I could probably give you a rough idea without actually without tapping the drum.
Yeah, and what I'm thinking is whoever it is that's setting up the drum corps, when they're looking at where things are sitting physically with the instrument, can they sort of get a feel for, okay, so, you know, this is usually about where we set them, or we're pretty good, or almost.
It depends also on how old the heads are, because the heads stretch, the top heads and the bottom heads stretch. So the older they are, the less of the tension rod you're going to see. But a newer head, it could be okay, but there's more tension rod showing just because it's not stretched out enough yet.
It generally comes down to just to how it sounds to you, both on the batter head and the snare head.
Yes.
There's a sort of pitch that you're kind of comfortable with.
Yeah, and that's kind of a learned thing by really being involved in it, knowing the idiom so well.
At the end of the day, when you put the drums together, do they sound about right?
Yeah.
Again, back to Ed's point, are they dull or are they too sharp?
Yeah, we just talked about the bass and tenor, definite or indefinite. I think now they are definite pitch instruments, and that's true even in I've helped out a couple high school marching bands. They have definite intervals between the multiple bass drums and whatnot. And we have definite pitches and intervals between the bass and tenor drums now, in relationship to how the pipes in our particular band are tuning. So that varies from band to band depending on the frequency of the pipes that are being played in that band. And I always check with the pipe major before I tune up the bass and tenors. I have him play a low A, I take the tuner and see exactly where he is. A couple cents, could be 10 cents sharper or flatter, and I make accommodations for that.
As an adjudicator, you have to identify that there is or is not a problem with that, and B, what the problem is in your opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Are they too sharp?
Yeah,
is there a reasonable interval? Can
yes.
you identify the intervals between them?
Correct. This is kind of a vague question. What are we looking for as far as characteristics of sound in the drum corps? The last 50 years has been a preoccupation with high pitch. Everybody's been trying to get drums sharper and sharper and sharper and sharper. Now, we have the capability. The hardware is getting the pitch up there without breaking the drums, which it used to do. Get the pitch where you want, but 2 months later your drums would collapse. But that's not happening now. So now that we're getting that, now we're having discussions about what happens when the drums are too sharp. The thin sound, lack of projection, et cetera, that we talked about earlier. So we have to find a nice balance between the nice crisp, sharp pitch that we want and the definition, the projection, and matching the pipes. I've heard the sharpness of the pipes go up and up and up, and it finally has started to come down a little bit in the past few years. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you have to do it, doesn't mean you should do it.
Are we going to be talking about the bass drum at all?
Yes. And if you find a good spot to talk about it, go right ahead. Okay, what are dynamics?
Difference in volume, light and shade.
Light and shade, difference of volume, varying degrees of loudness and softness through volume. That's something that the drum corps, this aspect of dynamics is something that only the drum corps can do. The pipes can, again, I said earlier, can add a stronger reed or weaker reed, but they cannot do it during a performance. The only thing they could do was start or stop.
It can also include silence. Tacit does.
It's what drummers use to create excitement in the music. That's what we're doing here. Every time you get quieter, it draws the audience in. Oh, they just did something. What are they going to do? And then you have a big, when you get louder, big explosion. Again, it draws the audience in.
Even not playing at all.
How do we create dynamics? By accenting, by crescendoing, gradually getting louder, diminuendo, gradually getting quieter, embellishments. So going from a simple phrase with just taps to adding flams and drags and ruffs and rolls and whatnot. We have chips, unison parts where the core drummers come in and out, starting and stopping while the lead drummer continues to play. So we go from the full drum corps essentially to one drummer and back to a full drum corps. And any variation thereof. You can have a couple people playing chips, or the whole drum corps playing chips, or the whole drum corps playing everything, or just one person playing.
You can also use the midsection to embellish phrases.
Absolutely. Or
both visually and audibly.
yes. And again, this is not a complete list. There's anybody that's watching this can add more to it. If you have another idea, please, that's absolutely correct. Don't think that because it's not on this list, you're wrong.
You'll just be able to express it.
Exactly, and be able to say in writing, because that's what judges do, express themselves in writing, why these work. Tacit, Tom just mentioned that earlier, not playing, using a rest, just stopping completely. The entire drum corps stopping creates a nice effect, a nice dynamic effect.
Yeah, one of the things that is actually, I think the best way I heard that expressed was by Bob Worrell. He refers to it as voicing. And what he says is that it may be the midsection, it may be the snares, it may be the entire section, just gives way to the pipe section, lets them play, and then comes back in. And it provides a beautiful complement to it. And that's actually, I mean, any of these things, of course, can be overdone, but voicing is one of the simplest and most effective ways to create ensemble. I mean, it's a it's actually a very, very powerful tool, because you've got a corps that's basically confident enough in their ability to stop playing and then come back in right at the appropriate time, such that they're complementing that pipe corps. And that's an extremely effective tool. I mean, it's not only allows the band to show off the sound of the pipe corps, but then the blend that they get when they come back and play together. Because after all, if it's done properly, you've got to really be right on the beat when you do that sort of thing. It can't be a ragged coming back in or something like that. It's really got to, in order for it to be effective, it's got to be done together. And it's an extremely effective way of not only showing off different facets of the band, but demonstrating your ensemble.
Yeah, I mean the big grade one band, the Field Marshals and the Simon Frasers and some other tools, they've made just exactly what Bob's talking about. They have made quite a production of that now. Some really, it's voicing is very big in orchestral music.
Yes.
And big band music and stuff like that. It really can make all the difference in the performance.
Yeah, one of the ways I like to express, some people may not know what voicing means. They're thinking, basically it means taking turns. It's taking turns. It's any combination of these things listed up here done by any combination of people within the drum corps. So you could have the tenor drummers accenting and the snare drummers crescendoing at the same time. And then the bass drummer could be doing tacit time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any combination of anything up here by any combination within that corps. Stopping, starting, playing loud, playing quiet, accenting, embellishing. So it's sky's the limit as far as your creativity in the voicing or the taking turns or any other ideas you may have. But definitely creates a really interesting sound. It's not everybody just playing the same thing all the time, all the way through. What do you listen for in terms of a good snare drum sound? One of the things we have up here is a good pitch range. We talked about that just a little bit earlier, is the drum and a good pitch, again, compared to the bagpipes. Pitch together. If you're listening to this is more for an entire snare core. All the drums might sound good individually if you hear them by themselves, but then when you get together, same as you're playing the bagpipes or flutes or violins or snare drums, they all need to be pitched the same way so that they blend together nicely. Good snare action. There's some descriptive words here. Bright, not too dry or wet, not raspy or rattling, not choked. Basically, it's a snare drum, and one of the ways our pitch and sound are created by making the snares rattle, vibrate. They have to. So if you choke it, otherwise pull it too tight or push it into the head too much, it doesn't vibrate. It doesn't matter how tight your top head is or your bottom head is, the pitch of your drum is going to drop. Not too dry or too wet. Again, those are descriptive words to say how much action you are getting from the snares. I mean, choked is completely off. A little bit too wet might be a little bit too rattly. Too dry might be a little, just tiny bit choked, if you will. So you want to have a good snare action so it's vibrating properly so that you get the projection, you get the pitch that you want, and it sounds like a snare drum. And we have 2 sets of snares to worry about as well, so make sure they're both set properly.
And you want to be able to hear it coming off the bottom head also?
Yes, so the top head snares and the bottom head snares have to be set properly, evenly on the head so that there's not part of it not touching, evenly on the head, centered on the drum, and as you strike the drum, you should be able to make the top snares sound and the bottom snares sound and come out the bottom to where the audience is sitting. One of the really tricky parts about tuning a snare drum is that sometimes the sound you get when you're standing on top of the drum isn't close to what the sound is when you stand back 15 feet where the audience is, or 20 feet where the judge is. So when you're tuning it, it might sound a little bit raspy or rattly on the top, but by the time that sound vibrates and resonates and dissipates to your audience, it goes away. So you might think it's too rattly here, but choked back there. So you have to be aware of where you're standing when you're listening to the drum to tune it.
So to stand behind it, it sounds thin. The whole thing sounds thin.
Yes.
You're not getting the vibration of the column of air.
Yes. Okay, and you want to make sure it's clear. You want to be able to hear all your details. So if it's, again, too rattly, too raspy, you lose some of your definition, you lose some of your details. You can't tell all the good work that you're doing. You're doing all this amazing stuff, but your drums are tuned improperly. You're not going to be able to hear it. You're not going to get credit for what you're doing. Good overall timbre. No unwanted overtones. You don't want a ringing sound coming from it. Good projection from the bottom, just like Tom said. Wants to hear it through the bottom head. Elements of a good snare drum core sound. There's lots of aspects.
Blend is the first one that comes to mind.
Mm-hmm. Uniform playing. We talked earlier about technique. That's one aspect of this. Make sure that you're all playing with the same technique in the same way. Just because you're all hitting the drum at the same time is not enough. There's more to it than that. I always compare it to a choreography. If you're watching a bunch of tap dancers, they don't all just put their foot on the ground at the same time. They move their legs in the same way, they move their upper bodies in the same way. The whole thing is a production. So if your lead drummer says, I want you to strike the drum with your wrist motion, don't do that. And you just heard 2 different sounds there. If you hit that at the same time and everybody has their own idea there, you're not going to get a uniform sound. So if the lead drummer says to use your wrist, use your wrist. As though you were a dancer in a choreography, like a tap dancer.
So playing on the snare?
Everyone playing in the center of the drum. Tom just talked about that. That's where the snares sound the best. If you play off the center, it creates a completely different sound. I don't have a snare drum here, but this is a really good example. Playing in the center, as soon as you move off, 3 different sounds because I moved away from the center. It's that obvious when you play the drum as well. Everyone playing the same sound. Again, that goes back to the choreography I was talking about. Have the same idea in mind. Are you
Playing weight?
Same playing weight, same volume, same touch on the drum. You don't want to have one person pounding as hard as they can while one person has a nice light little touch on it at that section. You might have different phrases where you want to do that to create different dynamic effects, but make sure you're all doing it the same way at every phrase.
Same sticks.
Same sticks. Make sure, oh, balanced, unbalanced. This I've seen on sheets because there's a big, usually this happens in bigger cores. Like the right side of the drum corps is quieter and the left side of the drum corps is louder. So they're blending with themselves. To the right of the lead drummer, they're blending with themselves. This little core over here of 3 guys. And to the left side, this little core of 3 guys blending with themselves. But if you listen to the core, it's very unbalanced. It's like having a stereo on with one speaker turned up or one speaker turned down. It's very obvious. Sometimes you have to realize who the louder or quieter players are and move them. But you want a uniform sound all the way across the snare line. Technique, touch, again, make sure you're all doing it the same way.
As an adjudicator, you've got every reason to expect that would have been taken care of.
Exactly.
It's something you shouldn't see, and therefore it's a fair comment.
It is. I've seen more than once people approaching, for example, rolls differently. One person in the core does this. One person does this. 2 completely different approaches. They have absolutely no chance of sounding the same. One person uses big arm motions. One person uses little wrist motions. One person just tries to use their fingers. You're not going to sound the same. And so I've actually written that in sheets many times. Uniform technique needed for your whatever rudiments. And so you get together, make sure you're all doing the same choreography.
The other thing is to, again, mainly in the lower grade bands, to make sure that everyone is actually playing the material. Because it's quite common to see that not being the case.
Yes. Good example of that is the difference between like a 5-stroke roll and a 7-stroke roll. Because they're going fast, they think I can't hear the difference between this and that. That's the difference between this and this. But they're just putting buzzes on it. And it sticks out like that. As you're not playing the same sound, you're playing a completely different rhythm. But because you're using buzzes, you think you can compensate for it. Make sure you're playing the exact same rhythm through all of your rolls as well. In the same way, in the same technique, with the same touch. Same idea, same approach. Make sure everybody talks about this stuff. Good blend within the core. Make sure that everybody, again, playing the same way, blending together, volume, pitch, touch, technique. And so if you step back and listen to it, no individual person is sticking out while they're playing for any reason. With the exception, of course, of the lead drummer during the lead parts. Make sure that you blend with the pipes well. The sound of the drums should blend in with the sound of the pipes. Should not be too harsh, should not be too quiet. You should be able to hear it for sure, but not overpowering the pipes.
You have to adjust for whatever sound that pipe core is given. Mm-hmm. You might have a fairly large drum corps that's maybe it's a little bit bigger than you should have for that pipe core, but you have to take that into consideration. Say now you're going to need to have to drop your volume a little bit so that you don't overwhelm it, because it's a very, very easy thing to do.
Oh yeah.
Exactly.
I've written that. It's too big for this size of pipe core. Right?
Mm-hmm. I've seen that. I know exactly what you're talking about. If there's a big drum corps, to overpower the pipe course, you either have to drop the volume down and blend it together, make sure it's blending. It's not an absolute because there's X number of numbers. But if you can't drop the volume down with good control, then unfortunately you have to drop a couple people out for the blend. And that's true with the pipe core or the drum corps.
You see that a lot as a bass drum. Bass drum is far too loud for the size of the band.
Exactly. So then you have to blend the snare drum sound with the bass and tenors as well. Volume-wise, pitch, timbre, everything has to blend together. You don't want every single drum sticking out. You want all to be one cohesive unit. Good execution. We talked earlier about what execution is. Just make sure you have good execution all the way through. Clean playing, precise playing, clean rhythms, good phrasing, everything like that, as well as your drums tuned nicely and good volume and whatnot. No flat flams, good roll quality, and whatnot. Make sure all your rudiments are, basically make sure all of your rudiments are played exactly correct with good clarity, good execution. Lineup of the drums. But we're talking here about exactly how the drum corps stands. You have straight line versus a curved line, depending on what kind of sound you're creating. Sometimes if you curve too much, the guy on the end ends up doing a little bit of a solo because he turns his entire body and the sound of his drum projects the other direction. So make sure even if you curve a little bit, make sure all your backs are basically facing the same direction so the sound is projecting the same way. Versus a straight line, maybe sometimes you might have a better sound, but then you don't match up with the pipe corps as well, and there ends up being a gap, and then there's holes in the sound that way. So you have to balance that depending on the size of your band and the type of sound you're creating. You have to have somebody stand back and listen to it. There's no absolute way to tell in the circle. Spacing. Do you have the drummers really close together, them spaced apart? If you're too close together, I've seen kilts, because the thick wool absorbs some of the sound. That might be a good thing, it might be a bad thing, I don't know. But you might space them out a little bit and you can hear all the drummers more clearly. But then if they're too far apart, they can't hear each other as well. So you want them closer together so they can hear each other to play together. Again, there's no absolutes here. You just have to make sure that you're aware of all these different possibilities in the playing. I've written comments about all of this stuff at one time or another. Maybe pull the drummers closer together so you can hear each other. Maybe space apart so I can hear your clarity. Sometimes they're too close together, they bump elbows. I mean, there's little things like that you don't think of, but it's something to consider.
Come back to the point you made a second ago about the outside drummers being turned. As an adjudicator, you're hearing one or many batter heads, snare heads, that's what I'm looking for, snare head, and you're hearing the top heads of the side guys. That don't sound good.
No. Yeah, so not only are you hearing individual players, but the drums are going to sound way different because of the way the sound's projecting. Because they're not sounding the same head towards the judge. Carrier versus a sling. We talked a bit about that earlier. It's not so prevalent anymore. Most bands do not use slings anymore. However, there's some issues to consider there. The way the drum is laying might project differently, because when you're carrying the sling, the drum automatically drops down. Therefore, the bottom head projects behind you, and there goes the sound that way. If you're on a carrier, typically it's even, and the sound goes straight down into your kilt. It's a consideration. So people, now the carriers do have the ability to twist and turn whichever way you want. So projection is an issue. Which direction is it being projected? Consistency and stability. On a carrier, it's very consistent, very stable. That drum does not move, period. On a sling, sometimes if your body moves, the drum moves with you, especially if you're marching. So we talked earlier about playing in the center of the drum. Once the drum moves, you have to be prepared to have your arms move with it to adjust for where the center of the drum is. I remember learning on a sling, marching along, having my arms like this as I'm playing the entire way, because the drum's moving on my leg, on a leg rest.
Remember it well.
Yes. I remember learning on tenor drum with no leg rest, where it had to, the drum, yeah, I learned with no leg rest on a tenor drum, and the drum would go forward and back, hitting my right leg every other step. So I had a bruise on my right leg from where the drum could hit it, but that's how I controlled where the drum went. Because if I hit too hard with my right leg, the drum went flying. So I had to, a lot of my control where the drum came from my right leg when it came over this way. But the drum was not very consistent or stable. I had to really work it to keep it in place where I would play on it. Sticks, heads, and drums. We have lots of different types of sticks available, lots of heads available, lots of types of drums available. The combination use of those things creates all sorts of different sounds. Everybody has their preference, what heads they like, what sticks they like, what drums they like. And again, what combination. They like this stick on this drum with this head. And they all do create very different sounds. There's various models of all of them. The heads, the top and bottom heads, not just the top heads. People forget about that. It matters what kind of heads you have on the bottom as well. Thicker heads versus thinner heads. How long do they last? How tight can you pull them? How thick are they to create a lower or a higher sound, a thinner sound or a richer sound? Okay. This is kind of a discussion question, but what about like things that aren't used very often right now in pipe band competition? Rim shots or backsticking. You have to kind of decide what you're going to do if and when this happens. It's a rim shot would be either hitting the rim of the stick or hitting the rim and the head at the same time with the stick. And backsticking would be hitting with the bottom end of the stick as opposed to this. Personally, I'm open to it because anytime you have another sound available in your arsenal, I think it's a good thing to have another sound possibly to use used appropriately in the right spot. I would be open to it if it was used properly. Some people think it has no place in a pipe band competition area at all. They're very traditional. That's not what we do here. Save that for your drum salutes and get different sticks to do your rim shots and whatnot. But rim shots, the sticks we use are not made for rim shots. Typically, the sticks we use will break after a few rim shots, and they're expensive. And people get a very close relationship with their sticks. You don't want somebody else taking your sticks, they're yours. So you have to consider that. Are you willing to, for that sound, are you willing to break these sticks? They're not a dime a dozen, they're pretty expensive.
Well, the other consideration too is that when you do something unconventional like that, you're taking a risk that that particular judging group is going to appreciate what you're doing. Mm-hmm. Is the risk really worth it?
My thought on that is, if you're going to do it, you better do it perfect. If you can't do it, yeah, it better be musical, and your execution better be immaculate. If you're going to pull that, if you're going to go outside, if you're going to push the envelope, you better know where the walls of the envelope were in the first place. And that's why I usually tell most grade 4 bands, don't. Do tried and true things well first. Then we'll talk about trying new stuff, new creative things. But play your march well, correct, now, with the proper techniques that are tried and true. Save that for the grade 1 bands that have already done all this stuff. Let them push the envelope a little bit. I heard a great quote once from a lead drummer. He said he was having a discussion with his pipe major, and the pipe major wanted to try all sorts of new creative things. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. We're going to push the envelope. Lead drummer looked at him and said, we're in grade 4. We don't even get to lick the envelope. So I think they stopped all their ideas at that point. But anyway, so we talked earlier about about flat flams. In your execution, you don't want to have a flat flam. What is a flat flam? They are absolute death in our drums. Anybody doesn't know what a flat flam is? Normally a flam has a low note and a high note, and this hand hits first, this hand hits second, creating a full sound, a big blump. Sounds like it's one big fat note, even though there's two separate notes. Some people hear that as one sound, and they try to reproduce it by hitting both sticks at the same time.
Flat flam.
Flat flam. So whenever you hit both sticks at the exact same time, it's a flat flam. You want one hitting before the other. A flat flam also, not just because it's the way you should do it, it creates a very definite ping or boink or however you want to describe it off of our drum that's very unpleasant sounding. It's unforgivable. You can't hide it at all. So flat flam is when you strike the drum with both sticks at the same time, creating an unwanted overtone, ping or boink or whatever. Once you hear it, you'll never forget it. So what do you say to correct a flam? What's some wordings? If somebody comes out and plays lots of flat flams and you're writing on the sheet, you have to know how to correct that. You can't just say your flams are flat. They may not know what that is.
Separation between the sticks.
Separation of the sticks. Separate your two notes. Increase the distance between the sticks on the setup. Sometimes before they play the flam, I'll make sure that they have exaggerated that. So there's no question that which stick's going to hit first on the setup. Just before you play the flam, make sure they're separated. Exaggerate it. Sometimes people will say make the grace note softer and the primary stroke louder. So you're not hitting at the same time, doing a quiet note and a louder note. So you actually concentrate on two different sounds, which if anything will create more of than a flat flam sound. It goes the other direction, so it corrects it. Good quality roll. Happens all the time. You listen to a band play, you need to make a comment about roll quality. For some reason, you didn't like it. You have to tell them what was wrong with it, and now you have to tell them, how do you fix it? What are you looking for to make it a good quality roll? And more importantly, what are you looking for before you make your comments? How do you evaluate it? Listen to the roll. What's a good quality roll? Smooth, consistent pulse, even primary strokes. And the primary strokes are just the rhythm of the roll. Are you playing a triplet, like for a 7-stroke roll? Triplet 2. So smooth, consistent pulse. Are you not going nice and even, consistent? Not pulsating. You don't have one hand louder than the other, or you're not hearing every separate pulse.
That's I rate that a lot, and she's the opening rolls overly pulsy. Like tearing a piece of paper as somebody wants to describe it to me.
Right. Yeah, full roll pulses. So the pulses are the buzzes. Make sure they're nice and full. They're not really short, because you have no chance of having them overlap to make a nice full sound if you're playing short little buzzes. So sometimes to have people practice the rolls, I'll just have them practice making the buzz last longer individually. Sustain to the last note. When I was a kid, I was guilty of this, so now I will catch every single person who does it. So if you don't sustain the roll to the last note, you get this sound. There's a gap between the buzz and the last tap. And people will, if they don't play the proper rhythms of the roll, or they're uneven, or they speed up, then they're there too soon and they wait for the beat. And they know where the beat is, so they want to play on the beat, but they run out of buzzes. So they just wait for it. You want it all the way to the last beat. So that last buzz to the last tap have to connect.
And oftentimes what I hear is a non-drummer, if the rolls are not really crisp, usually what I'll write down on the sheet is the rolls are either open or ragged.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I'm not sure I know what the reason is for what it is I'm hearing, but what I'm not hearing is that nice crisp buzz with that beat right at the end of the buzz, which is what I'm listening to.
Mm-hmm.
What you get in a lot in the lower grade bands is indecision across the corps from one drummer to another as to actually, they can usually start together, but when that closing tap comes in, that seems to be something of a mystery at times. You get
Right.
two people, and you're always going to write somewhere. Second roll late, or
Yeah.
sometimes the second roll starts too early. Somebody jumps ahead.
Right. That's one of the reasons why I really stress when I'm talking to people is to make sure that you're playing a definite rhythm in that roll. It's not just a whole bunch of buzzes that start and stop at the same time, hopefully.
Kit Reynolds, he did a workshop with us years back, and he had it, just think it was a triplet, and he called it diddly 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 dum.
Mm-hmm.
That was the term he used. And that's it. If the chorus do that, and it just sorts the thing out like that.
Mm-hmm. I've had a lot of groups just do play that, and then they buzz it. And even to hear the buzzes, I'll have them play poor quality buzzes so they can hear it better. They go. At least they're playing the right rhythm now. They have a starting place. Then you have to think the buzzings out.
And they know what hand to finish on.
Yes. Exactly. It's a definite rhythm that they're playing. They're the same as if I wrote out a bunch of triplets. They'd all play this together. But all of a sudden they have the roll, and some people go too fast because they think to play a roll you have to go really, really fast. And it's very awkward.
My point is, as an adjudicator, you are going to run across that.
Absolutely.
Right at the start of the performance, no thinking's drop dead right there.
Yeah, it's a first impressions. If you have good rules, okay, you're listening to it for good stuff.
And the point is, another point is, if they don't finish together, then they're going to likely to jump ahead into the opening of the tune, and that's your attack gun.
Mm-hmm. Comes right down to the tempo.
And oftentimes, right at the start of a performance like that, those rolls are so critical that if they're not executed properly, the two chords are not going to start out together. Mm-hmm. You know, you have a breakdown in ensemble right off the bat, and I've seen bands recover from that. It might take them a couple of bars to finally get back together, but it hasn't been an uncommon experience for me to write down under introduction, you know, 2 cores not together. And I may not know the reason why they're not, but I know that they're not. And, you know, then usually what happens is after a few bars, okay, now they're back together again. And oftentimes it might be because those rolls aren't ending right on the beat. And that's kind of making everything a little bouncy for everybody.
That E has got to come in right on that last second roll.
Yep,
It's a joint effort for sure.
And if it doesn't, you know it doesn't. See that all the papers I've got to listen to is the quality of your rolls and the duration of them. If you don't do it right, you're leaving them hung out to dry.
And one of the other issues with that, though, is conversely, if the pipers aren't striking that E right with the drummers, you have that same problem. And oftentimes, I will hear a pipe core that actually slides into their E. They don't give you a full volume right off the bat. It's kind of like E, like that. Well, that little extra beat, when they hit that E, breaks up the unison playing between the 2 chords. So that's why, like you say, it's extremely important for the E to come in full volume right on that last beat for the second roll. You know, it's got to be together. And I think that oftentimes, I think that pipe bands, it's however they practice it. It can't be a visual thing in a competition because the drummers are behind you, but certainly when you're in practice, the 2 cores ought to be facing each other, and those pipers ought to be able to watch those drummers' hands and know when they're supposed to sound that E, just by what it is the drummer's doing. You should be able to listen for it, and you should be able to see it.
When you hear a core that snaps the end of that second roll, bass, tenors, snares all together, you're pretty sure you're going to hear something half decent.
Exactly. First impressions. Yeah, you're really listening to them. You're giving a really good fair look. You have a good impression of these guys going into it.